Soul food has played a critical role in preserving Black history, community, and culinary genius, and has also been a response to centuries of food injustice. Today we're speaking with author Dr. Christopher Carter about his new book entitled The Spirit of Soul Food. Chris Carter is a professor of theology and religious studies at the University of San Diego and also a pastor in the United Methodist Church. Welcome to the Leading Voices in the Food podcast series. I'm Kelly Brownell, professor of public policy at Duke University and director emeritus of the World Food Policy Center at Duke. Chris, thanks so much for being with us today.
No, thanks for having me, Kelly.
Chris, I can't tell you how much a pleasure it is to talk to you again. You were a very important figure in a meeting we held at Duke University with experts from around the country on food and faith issues, and it made me appreciate more than ever how much work has gone on, how rich the thinking is in this area, and how important work of this type is. So it's really nice of you to join us.
Yeah, that was an amazing conference for establishing connections and just, as you said, seeing that there's so many people that are connecting food and faith on a broader level was just really exciting.
Well, good. I'm glad you found it that way. So let's talk about your book. So you begin your book with a really interesting statement, and I'm quoting here, "I did not want to write this book." So tell us, why not?
Yeah, that is definitely an odd way to start a book. That one's been working on for about 10 years. For me, it was really more specifically about this particular version of the book. I had submitted a few earlier drafts throughout the review process, and while they were all received well by the publisher, some of the reviews were coming back not as good as I would like them to, or not as well appreciated as I thought it could be, and there was something missing. And I think one of the reviewers noted they felt as though I was being too critical, particularly the foodways of Black culture and the ways in which I was being critical. And that was my intention as a Black man. I'm talking about the food my people eat. I'm from Louisiana and Mississippi. And so my culture is very much steeped in the book. And what I realized, in order to do justice to my arguments and to really explain how my reasoning has evolved, I had to be vulnerable and talk about my own experience growing up impoverished, and talk about the experiences of my grandfather growing up in the Jim Crow South as a migrant farm worker, talk about the experience of my paternal great-grandfather who was Spanish and was an overseer, and the ways in which they had a particular kind of position of power on a plantation. It required a lot more vulnerability than I initially wanted to disclose. And I think the book is richer for it, and it allowed me to weave compassion in the book in a way that I think is unique. But that's not the book I set out to write, Kelly. So it definitely it pushed me in ways that I didn't anticipate, and I'm grateful for it, but it definitely was not easy.
Well, I, for one, very much appreciate the fact that you took the risk and went ahead and wrote the book. I think it's a really important contribution. So let's talk a little bit more about what you address in the book. So one of the things you do is you wrestle with the complicated relationship between food and agriculture and Black culture. So what, if anything, did you discover in your own research for this book that changed the way you think about this intersection?
I think one of the most powerful things for me that I discovered in this research was the fact that Africans were enslaved because of our agricultural acumen. And that was really just world changing for me. Growing up, my grandfather had a garden, quote unquote, but it really was like a small farm in his backyard. My family migrated from Louisiana, Mississippi, respectively, to Michigan. And they lived, so it's a tiny town, Thurles, Michigan. And he had this pretty good sized backyard because everybody had lots of space on properties because we were in the country. And so I grew up with a particular kind of appreciation for how to grow food, but not necessarily knowing that that's a part of, or associating it with my identity in any kind of positive connotation. In my research and visiting plantations down south, I was able to connect with the scholars and residents at a few of these particular plantations. And what I learned were the ways in which plantation owners were very specific in the tribal affiliation of the slave they were trying to purchase to it, depending on the product they were growing. And that just utterly transformed my notion and understanding of agriculture and spirituality, what I say about in a moment, because I think I grew up with this impression that Black people were enslaved because of our physical capacities. And I think that's a lot of what the myth is that we're very strong people and that we can have a high level of endurance, we can work really hard or whatever. And this idea that we were enslaved because we had a particular kind of skill set and knowledge and acumen that otherwise wouldn't have prevented the colonizers from actually being able to produce food really was in a unique way, like empowering, right? So it helped me realize the traumatic relationship we can have to agriculture and to growing food within the Black community because of the history and legacy of enslavement. That enslavement in and of itself, or plantation work in and of itself, is just, it's a part of the story, but it's not the only aspect of the history and legacy of food and agriculture for a Black community. And that was really, really important. And it tied to spirituality in as much as what I come to also realize is the ways in which the particular kinds of foods we eat, many of them are distinctly West African kind of celebratory practices we have, come from this kind of tradition as well. And that we've inherited these and they've gotten passed down. And so there's this way in which food has been this binding agent for us to preserve parts of our culture and identity in the midst of a particular kind of marginalized existence in America that's allowed us, to the words of my ancestors, to make a way out of no way. And so that really did, I think, change the way I thought about that intersection, because I no longer had to think about it as purely oppressive. I could see the liberatory nature found within our ability, reclaiming our ability to connect to the land, to grow food, and to be serious about our food ways. That's a way to me to do honor to my ancestors now, having done the research and written the book.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. And, you know, it reminds me of the book, The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, where he talks about some similar things about the importance of agricultural expertise among the people who were enslaved.
I absolutely love that book, and you are 100% spot on, particularly in the very beginning of the book. For those of you who haven't read it, he talks about the fact that many of the enslaved had their own little gardens that they were able to keep on the side of their cabins, quote unquote, that one had that tons of people stayed in. And those are crucial for them to be able to provide food for themselves and also some sense of identity and sustainability. So that's an excellent connection that you're drawing there, Ken. I wholeheartedly support it.
In your book, you chose to make the book a theological argument for food justice. So why did you decide to include religion? I know it's obviously important in your life and your profession, but why do you think religion belongs in this sort of discussion? And what's the primary theological issue that prevents Christians from various backgrounds, conservative or liberal for that matter, from making food justice a central part of their ministry?
I think there's a couple of reasons why I decided to include religion. I think the first one really is that as a person who thinks theologically, like, I am an ordained United Methodist elder. I'm currently a pastor at Westwood United Methodist Church. And so it's hard for me to disentangle those identities, I think, just from the way in which I interpret the world. And so one is just to be, as I mentioned earlier, be transparent about the ways in which I'm even approaching the topic. But also, interestingly, talking about race in the ways in which I do require me to talk about religion, because so much of the construction of race in America is tied to the role religion played in not only helping to facilitate the creation of racial categories, but to assigning them a particular kind of hierarchy that grew out of a kind of theological hierarchy. And so for me, if I were going to talk about some of the moral issues and moral challenges within our current food system, I kind of had to talk about religion, because religion was a big aspect, or a really important part of how we kind of got to the problem in the first place. And which leads actually to, for me, the second part of your question, the kind of primary theological issue. It really is what I was just mentioning in terms of how religion was used to justify this kind of oppressive hierarchy of being. And by that, I just mean the ways in which we give certain forms of being human more privilege, right? So whether it be male privilege over female privilege, Black over white, or able-bodied over disabled, and all the other various ways we go about being human. Among the challenges, I think we have the primary challenge with respect to taking environmental justice or food justice seriously from theology is we have the technical term is called theological anthropology. And that's just a fancy way of saying our understanding of what it means to be human is radically disconnected from the land. Our understanding of the relationship between God and humans and non-human nature is fractured. We've prioritized this way of being human that separates us from anything that's material, right? That separates us from anything that is necessarily connected to work. And so when you say what it means to be an ideal human is to be a kind of upper middle class, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, heterosexual male, if that's your ideal version of being human, then all other people are going to strive to model those particular kinds of ways, right, of being in the world and seeing them as the ideal. And so what it does, it doesn't allow for the plurality of the human experience. And so really my argument tries to take seriously the Eucharistic call that's in Christian theology, this idea that neither, male or female, Jew nor Greek or slave or free, that we're all created in the body of Christ. And so to exclude someone from the body of Christ by putting these boundaries on the ways in which they have to be human is an affront to the idea of Eucharistic solidarity, the idea that we are all part of the same body of Christ. And so the challenge that I try to cross in the book is, how do we understand and develop a new way of being human as modeling our lives after Christ? And so I talk about this idea of being human as practice, or in Methodist terms, as I said, I'm a Methodist pastor, we call this sanctification or Christian perfection. It's this idea of being human as a process, a goal, something we're always striving towards, rather than it's just assumption that it's just the way we are, right? So it's really about preserving and aiming towards particular kinds of ideals of solidarity, ideals of love, and ideals of interconnectedness that I believe can transform the ways in which we engage the world, particularly from an ecological and food perspective.
It was my impression you're speaking about this mainly from a Christian point of view. And one thing that was interesting from that conference that we both attended on food and faith several years back was how there were pretty distinct similarities across religious traditions in the way food, helping people in need with food and things like that existed. And those similarities were really fascinating. And it seems to me, but I want to see what your opinion on this, that more and more people are aware of this. They're more aware of the connections between food and faith in general, but specifically how it applies in the different religious traditions. Do you see that interest and awareness increasing as I do?
I do. And I will tell you, probably my second most popular class at the University of San Diego is my introductory course called Religion and Food. Now, on one hand, it's popular because it's probably the only class where you're going to get to do a lot of cooking. and some students really love to cook. So for them, they're like, hey, this is great. Part of the class is going to be eating food. Sign me up, So that's one part of it. But I think underneath that, what students realize, I have students multiple religious traditions. And I talk about how we use food to make meaning, how eating food is a meaning-making practice. Right. And through their food, they're able to kind of explain and construct their own identities and where they come from and their particular stories, their ethics and their values around what they're eating or what they aren't eating, and why they eat in these particular ways and how it's tied to their traditions. And so I think there is a growing appreciation for food in American culture, and particularly the spiritual dimensions when it's made explicit to people. They understand it almost immediately. Because we all have certain things we eat every holiday, right? We all have certain things that we eat because this is how grandma used to make it. And that is sacred, right? There's something sacred about that. So it's helping them tease that out a little bit so they can begin to understand how it connects to the broader sense of self. It's a really exciting course. And to your point, Kelly, I think people are really starting to understand how this connection is spiritual and regardless of our religious traditions.
It's good to hear your perspective on that. So back to your book. So you end your book by suggesting 3 theologically grounded principles for eating in ways that align with values of love, justice, solidarity, and interconnectedness. Can you share a little bit more about those principles?
This, for me, is kind of the culmination of the whole project. I try to identify as a practical theologian, and obviously that is just a fancy way of saying I don't want to disconnect my academic work to the realities of what's happening on the ground with people. I think it's part of the reason I still am a pastor. So I try to make arguments and suggestions that I think people actually can apply. And so the first principle that I talk about is what I call soulful eating. And that's really eating in a way that recognizes and takes seriously the kind of theological, moral commitments we are to have with non-human animals and non-human nature. And so that means taking this kind of assessment of where do we procure our food from? Like, where does it come from? Who is growing it? Are these people being paid fair wages? Are they being treated humanely? Taking seriously the fact that if you look at factory farms and where those plants are located, how they just do so much ecological harm, particularly to communities of color and poor and rural communities. And so what I suggest as soulful eating really is a way that tries to eat in a way that does no harm, right? And so I argue for, at its best, that for me, this is a kind of practical veganism, right? This is a way of trying to opt out of systems that we know cause harm, not only to our planet, but to people, right? That the people that either work in these places or the people who are impacted in those environments who live by those factory farms are disproportionately harmed. how can we opt out of those systems? I recognize that's not possible for everyone. I grew up impoverished, so that wasn't possible for me. And so I talk about trying to, in the second part, justice for food workers, how people who are of privilege work towards creating the kind of capacities and spaces to provide means for people who are low income and poor to access food in ways that does justice not only for them, but also to those who grow the food. And so by this, I mean things like, I think what Heber Brown is doing at the Black Church Food Security Network is a perfect example of the work I think religious organizations can be doing, where they connect with farmers to basically have more or less these kind of food hubs, right? The church literally becomes a hub where people can come and purchase food, where there's low overhead, because the point isn't to make a bunch of money. The point is to provide a service. So you want fair wage, that they're getting more than selling their food to just a grocery store. And you want to make sure that you're compensating the employees that run the business, right? The drivers and whoever. And other than that, that's really it. Like, it's really about keeping things low cost as possible, because you're keeping the dollar, it's staying within that community that's marginalized, quite honestly. And so, whether it's doing that, whether it's shopping at a CSA or a co-op, those are some of the ways in which we can talk about eating in ways that address justice for food workers. And the last one is caring for the earth. And that ties together with the other two, in as much as, again, how might, particularly if you're looking at like churches, for instance, how might we turn church land into farmland? Like, again, I grew up in semi-rural West Michigan. Our church had literal acres that just was grass that we mowed. What could else we do with that land? Even if we didn't necessarily want to farm it, we could have hired someone or let someone actually do something with that to actually grow food and provide food for the community. And it doesn't necessarily have to be food for people. It could be a cash crop. I mean, there's multiple ways in which we could use our land more efficiently. I think this needs to be kind of thought and taught in schools of theology, especially, so clergy can make this connection, and understanding the ways in which, again, this is kind of a spiritual practice. All of this to me is bound together through the lens of cooking. And so I know I talked about in the previous answer, the importance of cooking for me. I think it as a spiritual practice for us to really tell our stories, to demonstrate our values, so that people can begin to understand who we are and whose we are by the things that we eat, and kind of reclaiming the kitchen as a sacred space rather than thinking about cooking as a kind of chore, which often I think in American culture, we're taught to move so fast and get things done really quickly. If we slow down, I do this with my 3-year-old son. I include him in the kitchen when I'm cooking probably 3 to 4 days a week. And I talked to him about his great grandmother he would have never had a chance to meet, but I'm making something that she taught me how to make, because I want him to know her through this meal and to carry on that particular kind of tradition. And so those are the 3 practices. Probably the thing that always gets people jumped out is the veganism stuff, but I try to do a good job of explaining in the book that it's much more of a practical veganism that doesn't recognize that everybody can't do it. It's much more about a goal of trying to eat in ways that do no harm, that really puts the burden on organizations and people like myself to provide the framework so people can eat in ways that are in line with their values, so they can actually have access to good, healthy food.
Chris, it's so nice to hear you talk about these values and principles. And I couldn't help but smile when you were talking about your son and connection with previous generations. Just as such a nice thing. And to take these values like caring for the land and putting them in a spiritual context, I think is really important, because it brings these issues alive in a way that people don't think about too often, but should. And it also helps involve faith institutions in these really important social issues in an even richer way that they might have otherwise. So, Chris, thanks so much for joining us. It's really nice to reconnect. It's good to hear from you. And congratulations for the publication of your book. This is really important work. So I really appreciate you sharing it with me and with our listeners.
No, thanks for having me. I really, really enjoyed the conversation.
So our guest today has been Dr. Christopher Carter of the University of San Diego. His new book, entitled The Spirit of Soul Food, Race, Faith, and Food Justice, is available online. And thank you for listening. If you'd like to subscribe to Leading Voices in Food podcast series, you can find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Podcasts and transcripts are also available on the website of the Duke World Food Policy Center.